Welcome to the Introduction to Python Programming. This is specifically around the use of programming for the BBC Microbit, which we'll be doing this year. Now, Introduction to the Python Programming Language. You may or may not know that it's an object-oriented programming language, which means that it already has built-in objects and you can change the way they behave or change the way that they look, depending on the attributes. Objects in Python include functions which carry out operations on bits of data, variables which are containers for any sort of data. Classes are user-defined type objects, and modules are separate bits of code that you can call. Each of object may have data or methods, and for instance, a function inside a class is called a method. Python is case sensitive, so you need to be careful about this. For instance, classes always begin with an uppercase letter, and functions and variables are usually defined with a lowercase name. And here's an example. We can print hello world. Now that's a function and it just puts hello world up on the screen. If we look at the next example, image.heart, that's a class. And the image is the name of the class and heart is one of the attributes, and that's particularly related to the microbit. In other words, someone has put those classes together and that produces a heart with the array of LEDs on the front of the microbit. Now, another thing to remember for Python programming is indenting. And it's important because it associates lines of codes with a specific statement. So let's look at an example. We're using an if statement there, which we'll talk about later, but it looks at whether conditions are true or false. If gross salary is greater than 100,000, now see there's a colon at the end. That means that it's a statement and there are going to be indented lines underneath it that refer directly to that statement. If you don't indent them, then the program will just see them as extra lines of code and ignore that the statement, that they should be following that statement. So in this one, if the salary is greater than 100,000, if that is true, then tax equals gross salary times 0.3, and then net salary is the gross salary minus the tax, which is obviously what happens in real life. If a line under the net salary equals gross salary minus tax was not indented, then it means that it would be in the rest of the program and would not be associated with that if statement. Let's look at the objects. Now, objects can be defined as functions, which are a set of instructions that manipulate or calculate arguments in which they're associated. So we've already had a look at print hello world, and that is a function that sends hello world to the screen. The print is the name of the function. Hello world is the argument. Function names usually begin with a lowercase letter, and functions that are placed inside a class object, remember we said that's a user defined, are called methods. Each line of instructions in Python that involves an object or a function is called a statement. Python counts the lines on a program from line 1 and will often identify an error in a program with a description of the error and the line number where the error has occurred. So this really helps when you're looking for errors in your software. Python objects can be defined as subjects, as we've talked about. And the other thing to remember is that comments can be placed in a Python script by beginning with a hash. It is important to put comments in a program because it means that it's an explanation of how it works, and you'll see some of that later on with my examples. Okay, variables. Now, a variable could be defined as a container, and these hold bits of data, including numbers, text, and Boolean operators. Now, a Boolean operator is a true or false. That's what Boolean is talking about. Or lists, and I'll explain a list later on. Python doesn't expect a formal declaration of the variable and its data type. Some programs require you to actually set up a definition of a variable at the start of a program before you actually use it. With Python, all you need to do is say variable equals something, and immediately Python will recognize this as the type of variable that it will be, and we'll explain that in a minute. So, for instance, age equals 10. Immediately it sees it's a number, and in fact it's going to be an integer. There's no decimal places. Where salary equals 555.78 means that salary will be a variable, will hold numbers with decimal places. Completed task equals true means that completed task is a Boolean type of variable. And finally, name equals Abercrombie Snodgrass means that name is a string variable. Variables always begin with a lowercase letter. Names of variables should describe the data contained. So I wouldn't want to see variables with x equals something or y equals something, because that does not explain the data contained. If you look at the top of the examples I've given, that does explain it. And examples are name equals Harry, price equals $5.60, age equals 7. These all describe the data that's being contained. Each variable type may have a number of data types. The data types, as we just talked about, number, these include three main data types. Integer, which is just a whole number, it can be negative. A long, which is a big whole number. Now, both of these don't include decimal places. And finally, a float, which is a number that does include decimal places. It can be a negative number. And you also notice that 6.023E23 actually represents the number 6.023 by 10 to the 23, which is in standard form. Number variables have values, so you can use them in calculations, and Python understands basic arithmetic. String variables contain one or more characters, and here's some examples. Name equals Slarty Bartfast, address equals 25 High Street, response equals Y, or it could be associated with yes. Notice that the assigned data is surrounded by quotation marks. This indicates that they're string variables. String have no values, so 25 High Street means that 25 isn't a number, it's just a couple of characters. And finally, Python doesn't have a character variable, but a string of length 1. Also, some more variable data types. Boolean variables will hold the values true or false. These are used to hold the status of a condition or flag a particular event occurring. Notice, or NB, that the true or false data must begin with an uppercase letter. The final variable is a list. This mirrors some of the properties of an array variable used in other programming languages. To set a list variable, a number of bits of data need to be assigned to the variable using a comma delimiter. In other words, a comma between each of the separate bits of data. And the list of data needs to be encapsulated in square brackets. Here's an example. Student list is Harry, Sally, Bob, Mary. So they're all the ones in that list called student list. Weekly sales, 45, 67, 34, 187, 34, 185 are all separate bits of data that are held in the weekly sales list. Each element of the list is indexed with a number. The fourth element of the list could be written as student list 3 and would contain Mary. Why is it 3 instead of 4? Well, index positions start at 0, not at 1. So the fourth position would be 0, 1, 2, 3, not 1, 2, 3, 4. Some Python classes. A class is a user-defined object that contains data and/or functions. It sets a template for any variable of this class definition. A class has attributes which can be custom built by the programmer. These attributes can either be data or functions, which are called methods. Class names always begin with an uppercase letter. Attributes of a class can be called by using the dot operator. Here's some examples. Image.heart. That means that the class is image and the attribute is heart. Heart is a predefined image that we talked about on the microbit. Employee.function1. Now, function1 is a predefined function which is part of the employee class. When you're setting up classes, you set up class and then a class name, which will be the name of whatever you're setting up. Image or employee are the two examples above. Once you've done that, any statements indented after the first line belong to the class. So anything you want to be in the class, make sure it's indented. Here's some examples. We're going to put a Python program and demonstrate instantiating a class. So the class is going to be called dog. Okay, inside the dog class, there'll be two simple variables, which are attributes, and they're called attrib1, which is mammal, and attrib2, which is dog. Then we're going to have a method, and the method is printing each of these. So it's print I'm a self.attrib1 and I'm a self.attrib2. Self just means it's in the current class that you're dealing with. So we've called dog. Then I'm going to set outside of the class Roger equals dog. Now that means that Roger becomes a class of the type called dog. Then I'm going to write a program which includes Roger. So print roger.attrib1 and then roger.fun. Well, when we print Roger attrib1, what happens is that mammal appears because that's our attrib1. Then I run Roger fun and it says print I'm a self attrib1, which is I'm a mammal, and print I'm a self attrib2, which is a dog. Once you understand this, it'll be a lot easier to understand classes. Flow controls. There are a number of ways on which we can control how a program behaves or runs. These statements are always terminated with a colon. These include while and for loops and if then else decision-making structures. If then else statements. These statements make a decision on program behavior depending on whether the condition associated with the if is true or false. If the condition is true, then follow the indented code after the if. If it's not true, then the else will execute the code indented after the else. So it gives you an option if you like. And examples are if age is less than 18, print you are too young to obtain a driver's license. Otherwise, or else, print you are eligible to obtain a driver's license. Here's your two options. The condition associated with the if statement is whether the person is less than 18 or not. Python flow control structures are loops. This is another one. These are things that repeat code for a particular number of times, or could be an eternal loop if you wish. A while loop will continue execute the code that is indented after the loop while the condition associated with the while loop is true. For example, while gross salary is greater than 20,000, tax equals gross salary times 0.3, net salary equals gross salary minus tax, print net salary. Now, that's part of a program, and while that gross salary was 20,000, it would do this loop over and over and over again for each of the gross salary values that were in the gross salary variable. Once the gross salary, once the value in gross salary was $20,000 or less, it would stop the loop. A for loop will repeat the indented code a finite number of times, so you can indicate how many times you want. For instance, towns, Morwell, Tyres, Traralgon, Moe are in the list called towns. If you want to print them, then for Latrobe in range 4, print towns Latrobe. In other words, it's going to print it 0, 1, 2, 3, and putting that into the Latrobe index of towns, and that will then list all of your towns. So towns is a list of Latrobe townships, and for this for loop will print all of the list from towns index number 0 to towns index number 3. Using Python for the microbit. The microbit can be programmed using a variety of language. We're going to use Python. Fortunately, people have done a lot of work setting up libraries of code for the Python to program the microbit, so we don't have to do it. So when you're beginning a script in Python for the microbit, the first line of the program will always contain from microbit import. An example is a simple microbit program in Python could look like this: from microbit import. So we pull in the microbit library, then display.show image.happy. In other words, we're going to put the happy image up on the microbit. And from your knowledge of Python, you should recognize that display.show is a function. Image.happy is the argument that's in that function, but it's also a class. And class is image, and happy is the attribute, which is a smile graphic programmed for the LED array on the microbit. I hope that gives you some basic introduction to Python and how it will be able to be used to program the microbit.